Video game emulation, through the power of software, being able to basically have a device act like another one. So, in case most popular example, having a PC generally pretend like it is a console, or sometimes having consoles being able to play games from other generations or other platforms entirely. There are ups and downs to this, and I know many people don't like them, specifically companies, but companies themselves also use them, so let's go more into this. So one of the biggest pluses to video emulation is being able to just, well, play games on a device, not on the console. Mostly people do this if the console is old and outdated, so the games aren't exactly readily available. Like, the games may be available to buy secondhand, but not necessarily the console itself. Or in some cases, the game could go for absurd prices secondhand, in which case emulation seems like the way better option. One example I'll go with is Super Mario RPG, which originally came out on the Super Nintendo. After that, you could replay on a console afterwards until the Wii with the Wii Virtual Shop. Then the Wii U as well with the Wii U Virtual Shop, but after that, nowhere else. Then you have the Super NES Classic Edition, which had the game, but because of consoles, nothing else until the Switch got a remake. But you see how there were segments where the game was not playable. Let's say someone was in that segment want to play the game, but the console was outdated or the shop is down because, online shops eventually die out. So, by that choice, their choice will end up being having to play the game through emulation as a result. Another example is nowadays the Soul Calibur franchise, where the only way you play most of the games is through emulation because of the fact that they've been re-released. I believe while the Xbox series of systems is able to still have access to Soul Calibur 2 and Soul Calibur 5 and Soul Calibur 6 to the backwards compatibility, good on you, Microsoft. You can't really do that if you're on a PlayStation console, where the only option you have modern day is Soul Calibur 6 or Soul Calibur Broken Destiny, which is the PSP release, which we'll get to later, but also with that. But you see how there are gaps entirely when it comes to releases, because they've never been re-released whatsoever, or to be released not available. Like Soul Calibur 2 was on PS3, but only on PS3 and not PS4. So you want to play on a PlayStation version or whatever, you need to either get an Xbox, which some people don't want to get entire consoles for one game like that, or you have to pretty much emulate the title. Another good example is the Kingdom Hearts franchise. Yes, nowadays you have ports of major Kingdom Hearts titles, but not all of them are as playable games. Since Kingdom Hearts Coded/Recoded, we have over 2 days. Those are presented as films in modern collections and not the actual playable versions of those games that have to be emulated, or the original release of Chain of Memories on Game Boy Advance. Yes, you have the PS2 remake, but the PS2 remake may not be up to everyone's fancy, and they prefer the GBA version, aka me, our GBA version. So that version has to be emulated because of the fact that's not longer widely available because, well, the Game Boy Advance has not been supported for a long time. Yes, I know there are some indie developers that do make like Game Boy games, but that is besides the point. That's for the enthusiasts who still have them while not readily available for most people. Next, we have games that may have not seen worldwide releases for one reason or another, such as, for a good while, Final Fantasy V going to be played through emulation, or replaying the Japanese release of the game, or getting a fan translation off the internet, where that was the only way for people in the West to pretty much be able to play the game. Is how also I played the game as a kid. I also played a fan translation version of Final Fantasy 4 and 6, which I didn't know that was what they were at the time. So, to me, they were never Final Fantasies 2 and 3. They were always Final Fantasies 4, 5, and 6. But it's one of those advantages, or just playing games that may not have a fan translation, but you can play a Japanese game. Such as for me, Super Bomberman series, Super Bomberman 5 specifically, I believe, is a freaking awesome game, and at least for what I want to do with playing multiplayer mode, you don't need to know the language or to play the mode, because Bomberman, you know Bomberman, you want to play the game, which is super cool to have access to without needing to pretty much not only import a copy or import a Super Famicom. Granted, I know you can play Super Famicom games on Super Nintendo, but I own neither console. I do own a physical Super Famicom copy of Final Fantasy V because I love Final Fantasy V. Another reason that, well, I haven't personally gone with this reason is the reason I'm not excited is the fact that people emulating a game can generally get better performance out of that game than the official hardware itself. I know people love emulating Switch games on the Steam Deck because it has better hardware and can play the game perform better on that system. Granted, because those games are recent, they are still buying physical copies, which is the important part. They are still supporting the game itself, even if they're playing it somewhere else, which is also an important factor if you're emulating something that's more readily available. Some people do buy the game, even if they don't own the system, but they emulate the game because they don't own the system, but they will still buy a copy, which is the important part, supporting the developers. So, some people say, oh, everyone emulates will always be pirates and never support anything. That is not true. There are people who will buy the game, even if they don't own the console, but will emulate the title. So, there are people who do that. I don't really do that. I don't really emulate games that are current, because I don't really have much a reason to, because I can just buy the game on the platform I own it. But I know people do that, especially with the Steam Deck. Then you have the secondhand market, where games sold secondhand can go for absurd prices, either hundreds of dollars, sometimes over $1,000, which is insane for anyone to support, and by default, the answer should be to emulate rather than supporting that. And I know there are people who are insane enough to say, no, you should buy that secondhand copy that's clearly going for rip-off prices. No, anyone who says that is being an a-hole, because that is absurd to expect, especially when it's a secondhand copy. Developers, company, they don't see the sale from that, so no. They should go with the emulated copy at that point, because you just want to play the game. Yeah, emulate it. You're not hurting anyone at that point, and the company themselves don't sell it. F the person who's trying to make a ridiculous freaking sale by going, oh, there's over $100. No. F you. Screw that. Another point towards emulation is the fact that companies themselves will use it as well. Like, any company tries to demonize emulation, well, if you're not doing the exact same thing, whether it be stuff like Nintendo Switch Online, those games that they have are just emulated copies of those classic titles on the platform. They're not remastered or ports made specifically for the hardware, they're just emulating them. Same with also like PlayStation, where you were able to buy like, oh, classic PS1 games. Like, listen, I love Legend of Dragoon, but the copy of Legend of Dragoon I bought on PS5 is still an emulated copy of Legend of Dragoon. So that fact remains the same. Companies themselves use emulation. Also adds earlier to when we talk about Soul Calibur, how Broken Destiny on PlayStation is an emulated copy of that game, and also lacks some of the features, such as not being able to use the multiplayer mode. And since that game's single player content offering isn't that great, you're kind of not getting much out of it as a result. But that's a whole entire aspect with it. The fact that companies themselves will use emulation when it's pretty much benefits them, because hey, process works. If the game works well, you can release the game. Yeah, sometimes some official releases emulation may perform worse than an actual freaking fan emulation, but it just shows that companies see the value in emulating titles and sliding them back. And hey, makes the game more widely available, everyone wins. Another cool aspect with emulators is also, when combined with programs like Parsec, it can keep multiplayer games alive, especially fighting games, because at that point with Parsec, you're able to get online matches with people with a very good connection via emulation. So it's also a very good thing that is kind of more on the not mentioned aspect when it comes to emulation, that combined with programs like Parsec, you can get freaking multiplayer matches in games, which is freaking cool. I remember doing this on this channel, just to have me and my friends play Mario Party together, and there are people who do whole fighting game tournaments just like that. That is freaking awesome, and a cool aspect when it comes to games that aren't supported anymore. You can still have that aspect with playing online matches. Now let's go over the downsides of emulation, because yes, there are downsides to emulating a game. Let's go with the first one. Depending on the hardware being emulated, it can be more difficult. Like, something like a Super Nintendo emulator can be simple to set up, but then you start getting more difficult where it's like, oh, PlayStation, gonna require a bit of work. PlayStation 2, gonna require even more work, especially needing your own BIOS in order to even run the emulator as well. Then, you want to get the, let's example, the most complicated one I've gotten, a PlayStation 3 emulator to work, prepared to be trying to set that thing up for hours, trying to find tutorials in order to get it to work. So, depending on the system you're emulating, it can be complicated, or maybe sometimes the system emulating may not even have a proper emulator as well. So there is that issue of not every emulator is easy to set up. Sometimes a system could be like a PSP where it's, oh, so simple, you can do it on a phone, but more complicated hardware will require more effort when it comes to emulation. Then you have emulation-only issues, where bugs will start popping up that are only happening because the game is being emulated. If we're put on natural hardware, these issues wouldn't even exist, which can affect how someone views a game, because they'll assume when they only play the emulation, these bugs are part of the experience, but no. That's not the case. Sometimes games just bug out through emulation and would perform perfectly if they were actually played on hardware, which is the issue that I don't see many people bring up when it comes to trying to whole entire advocate for emulation. Sometimes the experience may not be one-to-one with actually playing it on official hardware. And that's not just for fan emulation either. That even goes for official emulation, where there can be technical issues that happen that would never happen if played on official hardware. So even the developers themselves have this issue. Like, I remember specifically, for a big example, The Dragoon had several bugs, game-breaking bugs, because of the fact that it was emulated when it was on PS4 and PS5. They fixed the bugs later, but it shows how emulation is not perfect even when official companies do it. Or the PlayStation 3, where you can buy PS1 and PS2 games, but it's a fact that they may not work properly at all. Even with the original fat PS3, it can still have emulation-only bugs with the game. So I can see why Sony dropped the PS2 emulator aspect from it if it doesn't even working right. And even the ones on the PSN can still have issues. I had several bugs when it comes to playing the PS2 Megaten releases on the PS3 because of emulation-only bugs that would crop up and never got fixed in those cases. So even official companies can still screw things up with emulation. I mentioned how companies using emulation for ports is a win-win, but in some cases, like for example, I believe it was the Jak and Daxter HD collection on PS3, is the most beloved official release of those games because their performance being naturally made for the console. But then the PS4 and PS5 uses emulation, which doesn't perform as well as the PS3 version. So getting a good HD made for the console port just for the next generation to forego it for emulation that doesn't perform as better is a weird choice. It is for obviously for cost saving maneuver, but it is still ridiculous. Another issue with emulation is also if the game was made with a certain hardware in mind specifically, such as the Boktai games on Game Boy Advance, how you can emulate them, there are workarounds, but you don't have the ability to really play the game as it was intended with the solar panel and going outside using the sunlight. So there is that issue. Or The World Ends With You, where you can't really replicate the features of a DS/3DS, hence why its re-releases go for a different control scheme. But it highlights how some games that even developers themselves kind of scratch their head on how to port and decide not to in some cases, but it also highlights how the intended effect may be lost through emulation because it was made for a certain device in mind. Or the fact to play a game on a different controller than was actually intended for the game, which causes up weird issues. Like when I played Silent Hill 2 on the channel, I didn't know that the game had pressure-sensitive maneuvers, so as pushing a button, it would always do the hard press and never the soft press, meaning I basically had half of James' ability, and I didn't realize that until I was late in the game and I looked some stuff up. So there is that aspect where the PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3 has pressure-sensitive buttons, so games that have to be ported had to take that into mind, or the 6-axis in the PS3's case with the freaking soft motion controls. So there's stuff like that that emulation can't exactly properly capture because of it was hardware specific. So there is that aspect, but granted, this goes also another way. It also has to go for developers themselves, where they themselves may also suffer with porting the games and may end up deciding to just change the entire game. So those are the points I want to bring up when it comes to emulation, and as you can see, the positives greatly outweigh the negatives because of emulation, because if a game's not widely available, not in your region or whatever, you have all ways to emulate it. Granted, I understand why people don't want to go to that effort, especially getting trying to emulate. Could be something like the PS3 or PS2 era or beyond, where the process can become more complicated than something like a PSP or Super Nintendo game. But if you're waiting so long for a game to officially release, and it never does for so long, at that point, you're just punishing yourself for what a company's choosing not to do, as opposed to being rewarded for waiting so long, you know? And there are some instances where some games do get influenced because of emulation, such as the fact I know that when it comes to like Dragon Ball games, the Super Nintendo entry, Dragon Ball Z Super Saiyan Densetsu, got emulated a lot in the West, and ended up influencing RPG entries, Dragon Ball Z games, including Dragon Ball Z Legendary Super Warriors, so there's that aspect. Or how many years people had a fan translation of Second Densetsu 3, aka the third Mana game on the Super Nintendo, which then, many years later, it got not only officially localized and dubbed Trials of Mana, but it also got a remake as well, which also helped revitalize the Mana franchise, which then led to, I believe, Legend of Mana getting freaking ported, and then we got freaking Visions of Mana, brand new entry, super cool. You should play that game. Haven't played it yet. Here's a video I made like months ago. Visions of Mana is great, but you can see how emulation can do good, even if companies, you know, kind of want to say that part out loud, even though they themselves will use emulation when it best suits them. So if companies using it, there's no reason you not to use them other than your own general disinterest. Either way, so I got to topic emulation because I used emulation a lot as a kid, especially for Super Nintendo era games. So that's like I said, I still played Final Fantasy V, which at that time had not been localized officially until the PS1 port that had that localization, then got a GBA port with more mixed localization. You have the Pixel Remaster, which is the version you should be playing. Let's call it the GBA version, but that's for a Final Fantasy V video, which I also did. I am swear that was a segue to videos I've done before. It just comes to the topic of emulation. Either way, that's all I gotta say. Have a good day. Play games. Gonna add an addendum here because before the recording was made, the Switch 2 didn't have its direct. Now it does, and they confirmed that GameCube emulation will be coming to the Switch 2, which is great, although I don't know why it's a Switch 2 exclusive feature because it's freaking emulation, and they have fully remastered GameCube games on the Switch, so don't know why it's been a Switch exclusive thing, but I see some people say they can finally now play certain GameCube games. I won't say finally, because you technically always had the ability to, but I guess more simplified matter, although people who think just because the official company makes emulation it'll be more optimized, no, as shown by some stuff I've shown in this video, but also even Nintendo and NSO had issues, like I believe Ocarina of Time had issues initially when it first came out to NSO, so it won't necessarily be more optimized or better than emulation, but it'll be the simpler way to do it. So more options for people is always fantastic, and like I always say, have fun, play games.